All right, welcome to the library. Thank you guys for coming today. I know we've got a small crowd today, but you guys are going to get even more knowledge from Chelan, our author, about KU basketball and 40 years of Kansas basketball. Super interesting topic that we haven't covered that much at any of our library events. So I'm very excited to have you here and to invite you to our community. Just real quick, in case you didn't know, our library is having our 125th anniversary. You might have just heard me talking about it a little bit. We're doing a community reading challenge, and we would love help reaching our goal. Our library opened in 1901, so we are trying to reach 1,901 books. Each time we reach that goal, we're going to give away Hutch Bucks. We also give out prizes monthly for meeting your reading goals. You can sign up on Beanstack or on our library website, and you can read anything. Anything counts. You should start with stories from the Phog. I won't keep you too long. For more author talks and events from our library, make sure to check out hutchpl.org. I've got an events calendar back here in the back of the room as well if you'd like to pick one up after the program. Anyways, I'll introduce Chelan. Is it David or?
Yeah, David's last name.
David. Okay, Chelan David, here to talk about stories from the Phog and Kansas basketball.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
Yeah, glad to be here in Hutchinson. So, Stories from the Phog actually was just pretty recently released in late October, so still pretty new. It's been a passion project of mine for a couple of years, so really excited to share some stories from the Phog with you today. First, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a Kansas native. I was actually born in Beloit, Kansas, in north central part of the state, and then grew up in Lawrence. My family moved to Ottawa, Kansas when I was in high school, so I went to Ottawa High School, and then went back to Lawrence to attend KU, where I graduated with a degree in journalism. And my first book is about traveling to all 50 states with my two daughters. They're now 19 and 17, but kind of our experiences on the road and our journeys. And then I live in Overland Park with my wife Isabel, who's in attendance, and my youngest daughter Kylie, who's a senior in high school, and then my oldest daughter attends KU. So it's been fun to get back to Lawrence a little bit more often recently. And in that picture, it's a little bit grainy, but that's me and Larry Brown, the former coach for KU. I attended a basketball camp way back in 1986, and he was larger than life to me. And it's cool because for this book I was able to interview him. He's one of the people I was able to interview. It was extremely difficult to track him down, but a great interview. People asked me how I fell in love with KU basketball. And like I mentioned, I grew up in Lawrence. And I'd asked my mom for several months to take me to a KU game. And she took me and my sister to my first game back in 1982. I was a fourth grader. And back then, tickets were a lot easier to come by. KU actually wasn't very good. In fact, we had a losing record that year, which is kind of hard to imagine. And we didn't buy tickets in advance. We just showed up at the ticket counter. My family of three were able to get tickets really easy. It was about the same price as a movie ticket. And KU was playing Missouri, and Missouri was really good back then. They had Steve Stepanovich and John Sunvold, and Norm Stewart was the coach. And we lost the game. KU lost the game by just 1 point. The score's 41-40. It's extremely low scoring. But that was back before the 3-point line and the shot clock. But even though KU lost, I just fell in love with KU basketball. Everything about it, the Allen Fieldhouse, the players, the pep band, the atmosphere. And ever since then, I've been a huge KU fan. And in that picture is David Magley. He was a pretty good player in the late 70s and early 80s. In fact, he was named Mr. Indiana Basketball, which is a huge honor. But a couple of months after my first game, through a friend of my mom's, I was introduced to David Magley, and I met him at a video arcade in Lawrence, and we played some video games, like Galaga and Pac-Man. And to me, that's just a huge, huge moment, because for a KU basketball player who didn't know who I was, to take an hour out of his day to play video games with me. And, he encouraged me we talked about sports, he encouraged me to play basketball and keep my grades up. And I hadn't talked to David Magley since it's been over 40 years. That's the last time I talked to him. I reached out to him when I started writing this book and interviewed him. And I asked him if you remember that moment, fourth grader back in 1982 and playing video games. And he said absolutely, just because I was so excited to be there. He said you can never forget that. So it's kind of cool to put that full circle moment. And there's a large cast of characters in this book. I interviewed over 30 people, so including players like David Magley, Devontae Graham, who's pictured there. And then I was really fortunate. I was able to interview all 4 living coaches, and there's only been 8 coaches in the history of KU basketball. So that's I never thought that would happen. And Ted Owens, one of the coaches I interviewed, was actually 96. He's 96 years old right now. So I was fortunate to be able to interview all 4 living coaches. And then some broadcasters, including Brian Haney, who's the voice of the Jayhawks. And I interviewed Brian for this book and also asked him if he'd write it forward. And he said he'd be happy to. And I was kind of expecting, a few paragraphs or so, but he actually took the time to write like a 3 or 4 page forward, very personal. As he talked about how when he was a kid growing up in Topeka, his dad used to take him to KU games, and how that really planted the seeds for him becoming the voice of the Jayhawks, and how he fell in love with KU basketball as well. And then Kevin Harlan, a pretty well-known broadcaster, he actually attended KU, and one of his first jobs out of college was calling KU games. And then he also, after KU, he broadcast in Missouri, so it's really interesting to see his perspective of that rivalry. And then some athletic directors, including Drew Jennings, who was an interim athletic director when he hired Bill Self. And he was only an interim athletic director for about 2 months. And he chuckles because he's in the corporate world for decades. He worked at Kansas City Power Light as a CEO. But he said no one remembers him for that. The only thing people remember him for is hiring Bill Self. And he kind of chuckles about that. And then I interviewed Travis Scott, the current athletic director, and kind of changing the landscape of college sports and NIL and transfer portal and all those things. Some film directors, including the film director. Are any of you guys familiar with The Day After? Is it made for TV film? Which was huge back in 1983. It's actually the most watched television program in history. For a long time, over 100 million people watched it. But the reason I included that in the book is because there's a scene, it's filmed in Lawrence. It's about nuclear holocaust, the Soviet Union bombing a town in the Midwest. And it's filmed in Lawrence, Kansas. And then part of it was filmed in Allen Fieldhouse. It served as an infirmary where the sick and injured were. So it's kind of interesting to get that part in. And the film director didn't think that it'd be nearly as well known as it became. It was on the cover of Time magazine. Everybody was talking about it. Back then, there's only 3 television stations. So basically everybody, would huddle in the living room and watch the same program. But Ronald Reagan actually watched that The Day After. And it's your only hero that after watching that, he came to understand that there's no such thing as a winnable nuclear war. And after that, they actually negotiated a treaty with the Soviet Union where they reduced nuclear weapons for the first time in history. So it's kind of cool that Allen Fieldhouse played a small role in that world peace. And then some people that you might not expect to be in a book about KU basketball, but members of the band, one of the mascots, people that just make Allen Fieldhouse such a special venue. Just out of curiosity, how many of you guys have been to a game at Allen Fieldhouse? Okay. And then parents, including Devontae Graham's mother, and she was only 14 years old when she had Devontae Graham, so they're extremely close. And when Devontae Graham was playing, most people played 3 or 4 years, kind of different era, even though it's less than 10 years ago. But it's cool to see from a parent's perspective how a player matured through the program, and not only as a basketball player, but also just as a person. And then as I interviewed the great-granddaughter of James Naismith and Phog Allen's grandson, and then some super fans, including one of the people who's responsible for the famous Beware of the Phog banner, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the presentation. But in the lead role is Allen Fieldhouse, and that's the one thing that stays constant through the entire book. And Allen Fieldhouse was dedicated in 1955. KU was playing K-State in that game, and KU won like they do almost every game at home. And to this day, it set the attendance record. is over 17,500 people. And
Wow.
I think the fire marshal must have been taking a day off because the standing room only is just packed. And that's a record that'll never be broken because over the years there have been several renovations. The seating capacity now is 15,300, so that mark will never be touched. Since Allen Fieldhouse opened its doors, Keys won almost 90% of the games at home. It's about 87%. It's the largest college basketball arena in the country. In 2017 against West Virginia, it measured at over 130 decibels. And to put that in perspective, that's like a jet airplane taking off next to your ear. So actually, prolonged exposure could cause you some hearing loss. I think you mentioned you were at that game, right? And that's a very memorable game for another reason, which I'll talk about too. And then Jay Billis, he's a national commentator, went to Duke, calls Allen Fieldhouse the St. Andrews of college basketball. And it's also often referred to as the cathedral of college basketball as well. And that picture's me and my two daughters a few years ago in front of the Phog Allen statue. And one of the people I was really fortunate to interview was Warren Corman. He's one of the original architects of Allen Fieldhouse. And he was only 24 years old when he landed this job. He's a junior architect. So it was really an assignment for the ages. And he actually worked at the state capitol, their house in Topeka. And he got to know Phog Allen really well because Phog Allen was so hands-on with everything, basketball, the building of the new arena. And one of the things that, well, Phog Allen had been pushing for a new arena for decades. There's a couple of things that stalled the progress. First is the Great Depression, there's World War II. And then they finally got funding from the state legislators. It's about $2.5 million. But then the government was rationing steel because of the Korean War. And so Phog Allen and the athletic director at the time flew to Washington, D.C. and said they'd make part of Allen Fieldhouse an armory so they could get the steel that they needed because it's wartime efforts. And so the people in Washington, D.C. gave their blessing. And for a short period, Allen Fieldhouse, a small part, actually served as an armory. They stored ammunition there. And so if you ever go to a game at Allen Fieldhouse, there's a video that plays right before every game. And right at the very beginning of the video, there's a image of Allen Fieldhouse under construction. And then there's a blueprint. And for just a brief second, it says armory. And I never really realized that before until I knew the story. But you can see it on YouTube too. But if you ever watch that video, it says armory, which is kind of cool. And Phog Allen was adamant that there'd be over 17,000 seats in this new arena. And the reason for that is that he wanted it to be bigger than Ahern Fieldhouse down the road in Manhattan. So he would check every week to make, he'd go there every Friday evening or Saturday morning to check on the progress and make sure there's 17,000 seats. And Warren Corman, one of his responsibilities was designing the windows. And that's one of the things that makes Allen Fieldhouse so unique. I've never been to another arena where there's windows. And they actually used to function, they'd open in that era. But if you ever go to a game in Allen Fieldhouse, or if you even watch it on TV, and it's a weekend day game, you can see the sun filtering through the windows. And it really is, it provides kind of a mystical experience. It's very unique. And then, so yeah, obviously the windows don't open anymore, so they can be pretty stifling in there. So I asked Warren Corman about the air conditioning, or the lack of air conditioning, because it can get really warm in there. I used to go to basketball camps there in July and August when I was growing up, and it would be so hot. But even if you go to a game in the winter and it's 60, even 50 degrees or above, it can get pretty warm in Allen Fieldhouse. So I asked him about that. He said that every fan, on average, when they're excited, they put off about 3,000 BTUs. Now, I had no idea what BTU was, but it stands for British Thermal Unit. And basically, it's the unit of energy that measures heat. And so he said that if every person's putting off 3,000 BTUs and there's 15,000 fans, he said it costs between $8 and $10 million to install air conditioning, adequate air conditioning. So he said, don't expect that anytime soon. But then I asked Roy Williams about that too, the former coach, and he said he loved the fact that there's no air conditioning because, the players would sweat and be in great shape. And I think all the coaches probably feel that way. And then this was interesting. I had no idea about this, the reason for this, but back in the 1990s, there were some renovations, and Warren Corman served as an advisor. And, they did some focus groups. And one of the things that they learned is that the women would complain because the wait for the restrooms was so long. And so Warren Corman took it upon himself to go Kemper Arena in Kansas City, where they used to play the Big 8 tournament. And he stood outside the women's restroom with a stopwatch, and he timed how long it took each person to come in and out. And as you can imagine, he received some puzzled looks, but he's able to get the data he was looking for. And he found on average women take 3 times as long as men to use the facilities. So when they did those renovations, they put 3 times as many stalls in for the women as the men. So now, me and my wife go to games, and usually it's quicker for her than me, which is another pretty unusual thing for arena where the men have to, wait longer than the women. So I learned that from Warren Foreman as well. And unfortunately, Warren just passed away this last fall at the age of 98. When I interviewed him, he's 97, still extremely sharp, great guy, but incredible perspectives about the actual physical building. And Alan Fieldhouse isn't going anywhere. I asked him about that too. And he said, those kind of buildings in Europe last 2,000 or 3,000 years. So as long as there's a good roof, that lasts basically forever. It's pretty sturdy. There's been some great teams in KU history. Generally, these are regarded as the greatest teams of all time. And I'm actually going to talk about the 3 teams on this list that did not win a championship. I'll start with the 1986 team. Were you in school in '86 or attending? I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up. But anyway, that's kind of you're a big Lee fan, right? Yeah. So 1986, Larry Brown was the coach, and is a really strong team. Danny Mann was a sophomore. We had 3 seniors: Greg Dryling, Calvin Thompson, and Ron Kellogg, and then Cedric Hunter was a point guard. And they ended up losing to Duke in the Final Four. And then Duke lost to Louisville in the championship game. But KU actually beat Louisville twice that year in the regular season. So KU can kind of make its claim as the best team that year. Unfortunately, they didn't win, but still one of the greatest teams of KU history. And then the 1997 team, and this is considered one of the great teams, not just in KU history, but college basketball history. It's just such a dominant team. They only lost once in the entire regular season, and that was in overtime to Missouri. And then they lost to Arizona in the tournament, which was a pretty big upset. But Arizona actually went on to win the championship that year. And Arizona had 4 NBA players, actually, that went on to play in the NBA. But KU was just loaded that year. Out of their 5 starters, 4 were first-round draft picks. And all 4 of those players played at least 10 years in the NBA. So you had Paul Pierce, Rafe LaFrance, Scott Pollard, and then John Vaughn, he's now an assistant coach at KU. And then our 5th starter was Jared House, who's a really good player too. And then the 2020 team, people kind of forget about this team a little bit, even though it's been fairly recent. But KU was ranked number 1 almost the entire season. They would have been the number 1 overall seed in the tournament. But right before the tournament was supposed to start, in fact, they were warming up for the Big 12 tournament. They pulled the plug on the season because of COVID. And I asked him about some of the great teams in KU's history. And I asked him if this team would be remembered with some of those other great teams. And he said, unfortunately not, just because the only teams that are remembered in KU history are the ones with banners in Allen Fieldhouse. And that means either a Final Four or a championship appearance. And he said, probably the next 5 or 10 years, people are kind of going to forget about that team just because they didn't have a chance to play in the tournament. And I feel bad for that team, but it is true. The only teams that are remembered generally are the Final Four teams or the teams that played in the championship. And I think the one exception to that rule is the 1997 team, just because it's such a dominant team. And then this is just from my perspective, but some of the greatest games in KU's history in Allen Fieldhouse since I've been watching anyway. And certainly there's some great games between 1955 and 1988. And it's hard to actually narrow this list down because there's been so many great games. I'll start with the 1988 game versus Duke. And this is the only game on the list where KU actually lost. And it's memorable for a couple of reasons. First, KU started that year they didn't start very strong. They were 12-8. Didn't look like they're going to do much. And they lost to Duke in overtime, but that kind of turned their season around because they started playing better after that game. It also is the first time that the Beware of the Phog banner was unveiled. And I remember I was a sophomore in high school. I went to the game. And I saw this giant banner, and I was like, I kind of wondered where did this come from? I was able to interview Michael Jenneman, who is one of the people responsible for the banner. And he was an architecture major at KU at the time. And him and his buddy were sitting in one of the architecture classes, and they came up with this idea of pay heed, total and beware the fog. And they recruited about 8 of their friends to create the banner. And then, they were drinking beer as college kids tend to do. And one of the students decided to steal 9 shower curtains from the dorm he's living in. And then late night over beer and pizza, they stitched the shower curtains together and spray painted it and brought it to the game. And these fans, like a lot of fans, are superstitious. So he lost against Duke, and they took the banner down. Didn't think they were ever going to use it again. They put it in the closet of their dorm. But they decided to bring it back for senior day that year. It was a really memorable senior day because Archie Marshall had been injured almost the entire year. Played just like the last 30 seconds or so. He took a long 3-point shot. Didn't even come close to making it, but the crowd went wild. And after the game, Phog Allen's granddaughter requested that they hung permanently. And ever since, it's been a fixture. Every time you watch a game, the announcers will say, beware of the fog or pay heed. It's on T-shirts and mugs and banners. But interestingly, the people that came up with that phrase didn't trademark it or copyright it, so they haven't seen a penny from that. It goes to the athletics department. And I asked if they wish they'd copyrighted it, but they said no, they're just happy to be part of the KU history. And they actually come back, that group of 10 tries to come back every year to watch a KU game, and they sit where the replica banner is and take pictures. But the original banner is, when you come in the field house, if you look up to the left, it's behind a glass case. If you look closely, you can see where they sewed it together and stitched it, and you can see the spray paint, and it's a little faded now, but I hadn't really looked at it that closely before, but since I interviewed them, I paid more attention, and it's pretty cool to see how they did that. And then the 1989 game versus Kentucky, KU won by a score of 150-95, which is still the most points KU's ever scored in their history. The most lopsided loss by a Kentucky team, and Rick Pitino was a pitch for Kentucky. In the 1993 game versus Indiana, Roy Williams was a coach for KU. Bobby Knight was a coach for Indiana. And Jack Vaughn hit a 3-pointer as time ran out to give KU a victory. And now Jack Vaughn is our assistant coach, possibly the next head coach. So. And then the 1998 game versus K-State, KU was celebrating 100-year of basketball that year. They first started playing in 1898. And as part of that celebration, they invited Will Chamberlain back for this game. And Will Chamberlain hadn't been back on campus since he graduated, actually. So it'd been 40 plus years. And there's a little bit of bitterness between Will Chamberlain and the fans. He felt like he let the fans down because he didn't win a championship. And also there's some segregation in Lawrence at that time. But he actually, during the halftime ceremony, he wore his Letterman's jacket, his original Letterman's jacket that still fit him. He got pretty emotional, actually shed some tears. And then after the game, he stayed for 3 hours to sign autographs. And, it was really cool that moment happened because about a year later, he passed away. And so it's nice to have that huge ovation that he received and to kind of have that healing moment. Then the 2003 game versus Texas, Nick Halson scored 24 points and had 23 rebounds. And Dick Vitale was calling that game. And Dick Vitale's been calling games since 1979. He's seen all the great college basketball players, including Michael Jordan and Patrick Ewing and anything else you can think of. But he's only given 2 standing ovations, and one was to Nick Halson that night. The other was for David Robinson, who played at Navy. And I was actually able to interview Dick Vitale for this book. He had vocal cord cancer, so it was an email interview, but he kind of talks about how special that game was. And then the 2012 game versus Missouri, that was the last game that KU played Missouri down Fieldhouse before Missouri departed for the SEC. And it's a huge game for a number of reasons. First, just the rivalry in general is the last game before they went to the SEC. And then also the winner of that was going to, if KU won, they're going to get the outright championship for the conference that year. And KU was losing by 19 points, which is 16 minutes left. and they had a huge comeback, sent the game in overtime, and then won in overtime. And that image is of Thomas Robinson blocking a shot at the very end of the game to send the game in overtime. And I asked Coach Self if he thought that was a foul. And he said the original block was clean, but then he came down on the body, so it could have been called a foul. But fortunately for KU fans, the referee didn't blow the whistle. And then the 2016 game versus Oklahoma, KU was ranked number 1, Oklahoma number 2. KU won in triple overtime. And it's also remembered, in addition to the triple overtime part, because it's one of the greatest performances by an opposing player. Buddy Hield scored 46 points in the losing effort. And KU fans actually gave him a standing ovation as he exited the court, which was pretty cool. And then the 2017 game versus West Virginia, I mentioned that earlier, but in addition to setting the record for the loudest indoor arena ever, KU was losing by 14 points with just under 3 minutes left. And once again, huge comeback, sent the game in overtime, and then KU won. And then you can see I have a recent one there too, but just about 6 weeks ago, we played Arizona. Arizona's undefeated, the number 1 team in the country. And right before the tip-off, we learned that our best player wasn't going to be playing in Darren Pearson. And Arizona jumped out to 6-0 lead. It didn't look good at all. But I've been going to games for over 40 years, and that's the loudest I've ever heard Allen Fieldhouse from start to finish. There's certainly been moments where it's been louder, but that entire game, it was so loud. And Bill Self, basically after the game, kind of credited the fans for willing that team to the victory. That's a pretty special moment too. And hopefully we'll have a rematch for the championship game of the Big 12 in a couple days. And then the image on the right here is the original rules of basketball that James Naismith created way back in 1891. He was a physical education teacher in Springfield, Massachusetts. And I interviewed Josh Wade for this book. He's kind of a self-identified super fan who grew up in the Kansas City area and has lived in New York for a number of years. He's a filmmaker. In fact, he directed a documentary for ESPN called There's No Place Like Home, which talks about the rules of basketball in Lawrence. But the auction for the rules was going to be at Sotheby's in New York, and Josh Wade happened to live just 10 blocks from Sotheby's. So he got in his head that the rules of basketball have to be in Lawrence. It's where the inventor of the game was the first coach in James Naismith and all the tradition and history. So he came back to the Kansas City area and met with Dr. Mark Allen. He's Phog Allen's grandson. And Dr. Mark Allen loved the idea that he didn't have the financial wherewithal to bid millions of dollars on a piece of paper. So he connected Josh with David Booth, who's a prominent KU Booster alumni. And in fact, David Booth just recently gave $300 million to the athletics department. But David Booth is a lifelong KU fan as well. He lived right down the road from Allen Fieldhouse. In fact, his childhood address was Naismith Drive, just a couple blocks away from the Fieldhouse. And he didn't think that the rules would go as high as they did. In fact, they went for $4.3 million. And at the time, that was the highest price ever for a sports memorabilia item. And the two highest bidders, neither of them were there in person. They were both doing it over phone. And they both had no idea who he was bidding against. But it turned out, in retrospect, that he was bidding against somebody from Duke, an alumni from Duke. So if David Booth had not won that, the rules would be at Cameron Indoor Stadium in Durham, North Carolina, where Duke plays. So we can be thankful to David Booth that those rules are there now. Yeah, I think there's 3 key takeaways from this book. It starts with the tradition, and then the passion and the hope. And you combine all 3 of those things, it's what's known as Jayhawk Nation. And it does start with the tradition. So as I mentioned, the inventor of the game was the first basketball coach for KU, still the only coach with a losing record. And we've had 8 coaches in the program's history, and 5 are in the Hall of Fame. And to take that even further, the 3 other coaches are not in the Hall of Fame. 2 of them reached the Final Four, Dick Harp, and then Ted Owens. People don't generally talk about him as a great coach, but he took KU to 2 Final Fours and almost the 3rd one as well. So just an incredible history. And then some of the players, KU players, went on to become Hall of Fame coaches as well, including Dean Smith, who's on the 1952 championship team and coached at North Carolina for decades. Adolph Rupp, who was a player and at KU and then went on to Kentucky, and then Ralph Miller, who was a Hall of Fame coach at Oregon State. And I think it's really interesting because when you talk about blue blood programs, people generally say KU, Kentucky, North Carolina, and Duke. And the arena at North Carolina is named after Dean Smith, the Dean Smith Center. And the arena at Kentucky is named after Adolph Rupp, the Rupp Arena. So you think about 3 of the 4 arenas are named after KU personnel, so that's pretty cool. And then in addition to the coaches, the great players, Will Chamberlain, Clive Avella, JoJo White, Danny Manning, Paul Pierce, and the list goes on forever, but just an incredible tradition. And then the passion, and you can even if you haven't been to a game in person, you can see it on TV, but every game is packed. It doesn't matter if it's a non-conference game at the beginning of the year or if it's a rivalry game in February or March. It's always packed and loud. And then the traditions, like the students ripping up the paper right during the introductions. And the Rock Chalk chant is KU, they know KU's going to win. So just so much passion from the fans. And then finally, just hope. I think, there's other teams that won more championships, but there hasn't been any other program that's as consistent as KU. And every single year, KU has a chance to get to the championship game, with the exception of the last couple of years. Almost every year we finish in the top 10. We're usually a number 1 or number 2 seed. And every year you think this can be the year that we win the championship. And if we don't, next year will be the year. And I think it's true for this year too. It's been a little bit of an up and down season, but there's that hope that we can win this year. And since I've been alive, KU's won 3 championships, so most years do end in heartache, but there's always that hope that next year will be the year. And just recently, this was a pleasant surprise, but my publisher submitted this book for an award and is named runner-up for Sports Book of the Year by the American Writing Awards. Sounds nice. And this is my new favorite piece of sports memorabilia, but this is my book signed by Larry Brown, Bill Self, and Roy Williams. And KU just recently played their 1,000th game at Allen Fieldhouse. And at that time, their combined record was 615 and 44 at the Fieldhouse, these 3 coaches. And it's actually a higher winning percentage now because they've won some more games. But it's really amazing. Those 3 coaches have a 93% winning percentage at Allen Fieldhouse. And you think about it, we kind of take it for granted after a while because, KU hardly ever loses at home. And they've lost more at home the last 3 years than they have in my lifetime, I think. Because they used to go 4 or 5 years without losing sometimes at home. But when you think about, we're in the Big 12 conference, which is a really strong conference before the Big 8 conference. Our non-conference schedule is always really tough. We play teams like North Carolina and Connecticut and Indiana and Duke and just a lot of great teams. So the fact that our winning percentage is 93% is really pretty incredible. And a few testimonials about the book. And then also I always love to answer questions that people have, or if people have short stories to share. Always love to talk KU basketball. So if any questions or things you'd like to share, I'd love to hear them. Yeah.
You did a great job, and there was a gentleman from Hutchinson that played on one of the championship teams, Ballard.
Oh yeah, Brett Ballard.
Yes,
yeah.
He's from Hutchinson.
Yeah. He's actually really good. He's at Washburn, I believe.
Right,
He's
he's the coach at Washburn.
He's done a great job. Yeah. And he was actually a pretty good backup point guard as well.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't as big as the other guys.
Yeah, he's definitely made some contributions.
He did come off the bench for him, and he's a Hutchinson connection.
Yeah. I remember him. I imagine he's doing a great job at Washburn, but I imagine at some point he's going to move up to another level too. He's still relatively young. Yeah.
I may have missed it while I was out of the room. What's your favorite KU experience?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, there's been so many. I'll say my greatest experience as a KU fan, it wasn't at Allen Fieldhouse actually, but it's a 2022 championship game. And kind of last minute, I decided to go, and I took my oldest daughter, who's now a KU student. And it's been on my bucket list to watch KU win a championship for decades, but you can't predict it. I mean, you can go to a tournament or Final Four, you never know if they're going to win, but to be there and witness it, and that incredible comeback, they were losing by 15 in North Carolina at halftime, and to see them win a championship in person with my daughter, who's also a basketball fan, was my favorite KU moment.
So you must have season tickets.
I do, yeah. So
And how hard is it to get season?
yeah, it's still relatively hard. Not as hard as it used to be, but and I grew up in Lawrence, so I actually started getting season tickets when I was like in 5th grade through a parent's friend. And back then, I think season tickets were $100, so I had a newspaper route that paid for the season tickets basically. And then I had season tickets all the way through college. You know, they're pretty cheap as when you're a student too. And then I didn't have season tickets for a long time. I moved around the country a bit. And then about 4 years ago, I started getting season tickets. And part of it, after the pandemic, it was a little bit easier to get season tickets for. And then, you know, I've just kind of renewed them every year. But yeah, my seats are nosebleed, but I think every seat in Allen House, you get a pretty good view. And yeah, it's just fun to be there and experience the atmosphere again.
You go to the football games too?
Yeah, not as many as the basketball games, but with the new David Booth stadium, it is really nice, and it's about halfway completed now, and they're continuing to work on it. From my understanding, the side that they're still working on will be partially complete this year, and then after next season, it'll be fully operating. But yeah, it's a huge upgrade. The stadium was over 100 years old and needed some love. But yeah, the atmosphere there is fun too, and there's a lot more people come to tailgate. And the way it's it's kind of the seats go up high, and it's really loud there. Even the seating capacity is actually a little bit lower than it used to be. Yeah, it's fun.
I haven't been to a KU game, but I have been in Lawrence on game day.
Yeah.
And just seeing the culture around Lawrence of the guard parties in Massachusetts Street was pretty packed when I was there as well. But just seeing that and it was contagious. I was excited. I wasn't even going to the game.
Yeah, everybody rallies around the team, especially during right around now. I guarantee. I think tip-off is at 8:30 tonight. I guarantee students are gathered at bars. Actually, that was spring break, but I guarantee there's some students already gathered to get premium spots, and it's contagious. I think.
We watched the 08 championship.
I do watch it.
The Final Four. We were in Allen Fieldhouse and watched them play North Carolina. And it was as loud as if they were playing in Allen Fieldhouse.
I can actually go. Yeah. I was in Seattle at that time, but I watched the 2011 championship game at Allen Fieldhouse. Very similar. They lost to Kentucky, so it wasn't quite as raucous, but it was pretty loud. It's fun just to share that moment with other KU fans. And then okay.
And we went down to Mass Street after that.
It's pretty wild. Yeah, it's a huge celebration. And when I was in college, KU went to 2 Final Fours, and people just car horns are blaring everywhere. Just people start piling into the street. It's pretty crazy.
We went to Vegas a couple of years ago. And the KU fan was just unbelievable.
Yeah, I've actually watched a tournament in Vegas, which is pretty fun. And yeah, I remember even then, it was a few years back, but there's a lot of KU fans. But yeah, and that's one thing. No matter where I go, when I'm wearing the Jayhawk logo, it's like I'll be taking, walking a trail in the wilderness, and somebody will say Rock Chalk. It's amazing that you have that in common with so many people.
We went down to South Beach, watched them play in Syracuse.
In 2003?
No, this was just 4 or 5 years ago. And it's 20. Well, Devontae Graham was playing, and And they all went shopping, and I went walking up and down the beach, stopped us. And I had my KU shirt on, and I heard it rock shop. Turned around, it was Devontae Graham's mom and uncle and stuff. So I sat there and had a drink with them.
Yeah, that's funny because she's really friendly.
Yeah.
I didn't show this to her earlier, but she had Devontae when she was only 14.
Yeah.
But the reason he wore number 4 is because he was 4 years old when his mom put a basketball in his hands, which is kind of a cool story.
Mm.
But yeah, they're extremely close. And you know, when Devontae Graham was in college, they didn't have NIL, so his mom wasn't able to get to very many games. And asked him what he thought about NIL, and he said, you know, I would loved it because I could have flown my mom in for all the games. So.
And there's a lot of discussion about whether that's a good thing or not. So
Yeah, and I, you know, that's one of the topics I interviewed people about, and I think the general consensus is that, you know, players should get paid, compensated because it brings so much to the university. But I think where the issue is that there's not really any rules. It's the Wild West, and it's with NIL, and then also the transfer portal where you have people playing 5 schools in 5 years.
yes.
And, Phog Allen's grandson said Phog Allen would have absolutely hated this landscape because, you know, it's not pure. It's there's no loyalty. So I think there will be eventually some rules in place, but right now I think most people think it's out of control. And it's hard because even for like hardcore fans, every year it's a brand new roster almost. And like at the end of the year, I don't know who hardly anybody is. And, you know, I actually pay attention. But it takes a while to figure out who everyone is. And senior days, you don't really know who the seniors are anymore, which you used to watch them, you know, progress and you knew exactly who the seniors were. But yeah, it's definitely different nowadays.
The last 2 years have been tough, but this year, this group's really good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fun bunch of kids.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And Melbourne Council is so popular. You know, we home run with that transfer. But yeah, he represents. I mean, he's what you're looking for. You know, somebody that plays so hard. He's playing for the Kansas in front of the chest. And Trey White, you know, has been a good transfer addition too. So yeah, I think we have the pieces. It's just playing consistent. But it is nice. I think now that Darren Pierce has been playing more with the rest of the team, we can start seeing them have a little bit more chemistry. So, hopefully they peak at the right time. That's what you can hope for. Yeah, unless anybody has any other questions. But yeah, thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
You did a great job.
Thanks, I appreciate it.